Welcome to Week 1. This video will provide a brief introduction to business cycles. There are 6 macroeconomic goals. Full employment. Everyone who is willing and able to work can find a job. Price stability. The general price level is free from excessive inflation and deflation. Economic growth. The size of the economic pie grows each year. Economic efficiency. We are producing the most output with the least amount of inputs. Economic equity. The distribution of the economic pie is equitable. And economic security. Through property rights and the rule of law, we are confident in our economic transactions. When we go to the doctor, the nurse frequently takes our temperature, weighs us, and takes other metrics to determine our relative health. Economic indicators do the same thing for the economy. It's a relative measure of economic health. There are 3 types of indicators: leading, lagging, and coincident indicators. Leading indicators move ahead of the business cycle, coincident indicators move concurrently, and lagging indicators move behind the business cycle. There are many examples of economic indicators which include GDP, the gross domestic product, unemployment, housing starts, retail sales, the consumer price index and the producer price index, interest rates, capital investment, inventories, and sunspots. In the 1800s, an economist and mathematician, William Stanley Jevons, was trying to determine causes for business cycles. And he was comparing economic activity to any number of different things, and one day he came upon this notion that sunspots cause business cycles. He observed that when there was increased solar activity in the near term, there would be an economic downturn. What they didn't realize at the time was that sunspots impact the weather impacts agricultural products, and during the 1800s, particularly the early 1800s, a great deal of economic activity was around agricultural production. GDP is the sum of the money values of all final goods and services produced in a domestic economy and sold on organized markets in a specific period of time, usually a year. GDP is also measured quarterly. It's important to talk about or consider organized markets because we all understand or hear about the underground economy or the black market. When we trade or barter, that's not included in the measure of GDP. For instance, if your dentist gives you free dental work and you offer to fix or patch his roof, that economic activity is not measured in GDP. Simply measured, GDP is the sum of consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports. It's important to note that consumption spending, what we spend at the cash register, is 2/3 of economic activity in GDP. Investment spending is not buying stock, but rather companies investing in capital expenditures. Think of the University of Richmond. When we build a new building, that's capital or investment spending. Government spending is self-explanatory. That's roadways, unemployment insurance, military, airports, everything that the government spends money on. And then net exports simply is exports minus imports. Inflation is a measure in the persistent increase of the general price level. It's not the increase in the price of one commodity, such as houseplants, but across the economy. There are a number of measures for GDP, which include the consumer price index and the producer price index. Which of those do you think would be a leading indicator? Nominal and real GDP. It's important to distinguish between the two. Nominal is not adjusted for inflation. Nominal, not. Nominal, not. We're making a point here. Real GDP, on the other hand, is adjusted for inflation. Let's take a look at this simple example. In 2006, GDP was 100. In 2007, we can assume that GDP was 150. It looks like there's growth, but we need to take into consideration prices. During both years, the quantity of output was 10 units. In 2006, the price of each unit was $10, but in 2007, the price of each unit was $15. Nominal GDP is 150 for 2007, but real GDP would still be 100 because we've got to take into account the increase in prices, the inflation. So therefore, there was no real increase in GDP between 2006 and 2007 in this hypothetical example. Let's now turn our attention to unemployment, which is a lagging indicator. There are four types of unemployment. Seasonal is based on that time of year. Think about Santa Claus and ski instructors in the summer and construction workers in the winter. Cyclical unemployment is based on the phases of the business cycle, which we'll address shortly. Structural unemployment is a permanent change in the economy, and frictional unemployment involves individuals changing from one job to the next. Full employment. Does full employment mean zero unemployment? Actually, it doesn't. Because of frictional unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment will never reach zero, but will be something above that. You can see this when you take a look at the trends in employment and unemployment over time. So now we're going to focus on actual business cycles. A business cycle tends to be measured from peak to peak or trough to trough. Since World War II, the average growth rate has been about 3% over time. Expansions have become longer and contractions are shorter and less severe since the early 1980s, except for that pesky Great Recession. A recession is defined as 2 or more quarters of declining GDP, and a depression is a very severe and prolonged recession. Now the trick question is, how many depressions have we experienced in the United States? Most people will say one, and they reference the Great Depression. But throughout this course, you're going to understand that there have been many depressions over time. The National Bureau of Economic Research provides data on business cycles going back to the mid-1800s. This is a really good resource. Alright, now it's time to take a look at the phases of the business cycle, and there are 5. Some books, economists, politicians, and even the media will cite 4 phases of the business cycle, but keep in mind there are 5. Here on this graph we have time on the horizontal axis, or the x-axis, and we have real GDP on the y or vertical axis. Remember, real GDP is adjusted for inflation. Notice the economic activity as measured by GDP peaks at some point, and from that peak to the trough we call that the contraction or the recession. Once we hit the trough or the GDP bottoms out at some number, there's a period of recovery, and that's the time where we regain ground and GDP increases to the level of its previous peak. Once we pass the previous peak, we're then considering the economy to be in an expansion. Let's use a simple numeric example. Let's assume the economy peaks at $10 and then it contracts. During a recession, economic activity measured by GDP reduces down to $8. Then we enter into a recovery when the economy starts to grow again, and between $8 and $10, that represents the recovery. Once we go beyond $10 of economic activity, we're entering new ground and the economy is considered to be in an expansion. Let's take a look at a graph of the Great Recession. Here we can clearly see the distinct phases of the business cycle: the peak, the contraction, the trough, the recovery, and the expansion. Here's a graph of economic activity as measured by real GDP since 2000. You notice the 2 pink columns represent recessions. You may also notice that we're in the longest economic expansion in our country's history. Your gut is probably telling you we're past due for another downturn. In this graph going back to 1947, you can see that there have been 11 business cycles. When you hear folks talk about GDP, you notice that they probably don't talk about total dollar amounts, but rather percent changes from one quarter to the next. In this graph you can see percent changes from 1993 through 2013. Notice how severe the Great Recession was. Let's take one final look at the unemployment rate. This chart details the data from 1993 to present. You can see clearly the 2 most recent business cycles highlighted in pink columns. Also take note of the severity of unemployment during and after the Great Recession. You'll also notice that unemployment continued to increase after the recovery began as measured by GDP, and it took quite a long time to actually come back down. Remember, unemployment is a lagging indicator. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and here's a great example. I have a 1960 Sears catalog, and in it I found a window air conditioner on sale for $169. If we adjust for inflation, that $169 in 1960 would be $1,457 today. Interestingly, I went on Sears' website and found a comparable air conditioner for $283. So the question is, why doesn't the air conditioner today cost more than $1,400? Well, we need to take into account a couple of things, including technological change, economic efficiency, and international trade. We'll talk more about that later. In the meantime, I would like for you to think about this concept and why it is that we can afford today to have more stuff. We have more stuff than ever, and even though we work a lot, we're not working just for subsistence. We're not working just to survive. We're actually working to have lots of extra stuff. Now, there are a lot of great things that come with that, but there are also some drawbacks. Alright, this wraps up our brief introduction to business cycles. If you have any questions, be sure to post those in the general questions thread in Blackboard. Have a great week.